Hey guys, it's Jackie, and today we're going to talk about one of the Laser World's worst four-letter words. Curve. I know it seems complicated, and it's one of those words that everybody's a little bit afraid of, but I promise today I'm going to break it down for you and give you kind of a beginner's view of what kerf is and how you can figure the kerf out for your materials and your laser to make building and creating easier and more fun. There are many ways in which you might run across the issue of kerf when you're creating things. One way is if you want to do some inlays. So for example, this is actually rose gold acrylic that is put inside of holes within this earring. So I inlaid those little pieces of rose gold acrylic. And when you want it to have that nice tight fit where you don't have to use any adhesive, it just pops right in and it stays in and you know it's not going to come back out. That is finding the perfect measurement. Another idea would be for if you want to have slots. So for example, I have this little, it's a little vase holder. And it's made of two pieces that I just slide. I just popped them in, slide together, and you want that connection point to fit perfectly. That's another instance in where you would use kerf. Or if you're making boxes or anything like that, you're going to run across some issues with fit if you don't consider kerf in mind. Now, some people will tell you just to go ahead and add 0.01 as your measurement or subtract 0.01 depending on what you're doing. And that's a good start. That's a way to be able to probably get it pretty close with what you're doing. But I'm going to share with you some tips today that is going to help you to really hone in and figure out exactly what it would be to get the best results. And I hope that this is helpful for you. Okay guys, we're going to jump right in, and I'm going to start with just some basic information about what kerf is, because I think that that's important for you to build a strong foundation so that you have that when you're jumping into projects that will include kerf. So kerf is basically the amount of material that is cut or burned away when you are using a tool. So for example, if I'm using a laser, obviously the laser beam is burning it away. If I'm using a tool in my wood shop, then I'm cutting it away and it's becoming sawdust. But it's all the same, it's all kerf. It's the amount of space material that is cut away with that tool. So just to give you a visual of it, I went outside and I cut two pieces of plywood. They are both the exact same size. And then my second piece of plywood, I cut in half. That's all I did. Took the same size, cut it right in half. Now let's say I want to put this back together. So I'm going to squish that back together and I'm going to line it up with my other piece of plywood. And you'll see here, there's a bump because if I line up the edges, that's perfectly lined up on both edges. I've got a space here. That's my kerf. That's the amount of material that got cut away when I took my, my miter saw to it. It became sawdust and it's probably all over the stuff in my garage right now. But anyways, so that's my kerf. Now, obviously, like I said before, with a laser, we're not creating sawdust. We're gonna actually burn away that material. That's what that laser beam does. But it's the same concept. It's creating a space or a difference in your material when you are cutting away a piece of it. Part of the trickiest thing about kerf is that it's not constant. It actually changes based on your laser, your settings, your materials, your focus, a lot of different things. And that's what makes it so complicated and scary. But I'm gonna do a couple little experiments just to show you this so you can kind of have an understanding of how these different things affect your kerf so you can dial it in the best for your stuff. So I'm gonna start, let's just pretend this is my material here. Here's my laser. See, I even have the red beam. And we're gonna talk about focal height. So if I am cutting from further away, let's say I'm cutting from this far, look at the amount of area that's going to get burned. It's actually this wide. I made it as wide as the wood. Now, if my focal height is closer, notice my red dot see if you can see that, is not as wide as the wood anymore. And so if I'm cutting away where that red dot is hitting, that's my laser beam, then I'm cutting away less here than I am when I was focused way out here. So the distance of your laser head to your material is actually going to affect your kerf. Again, because when I'm further away, it's cutting away a wider surface, creating a larger kerf. And when I'm closer up, it's creating a smaller surface. So it's going to have a smaller kerf. So that's kind of how your focus height can affect your kerf measurements. Okay, another thing that's going to affect the kerf, again, the size, the amount of material that's cut away, is going to be the speed that you use for your settings. And I'm going to use my little wood burning tool to demonstrate how that effect happens. Let's say this is my material. If I go quickly with my laser beam, so this is going to be my laser beam in this scenario, and I'm just going to go across this wood quickly. Okay, notice the line that it created. Now, if I am going at a slower speed with my laser beam, notice the line that it created now. So the slower the speed, the fatter that kerf is going to be, because it has more time to really burn into that material. And so the faster the speed, the smaller your kerf is going to be. Now, all of this is really just to explain some of the basics of how different things can affect your kerf, just so that you have an idea and a basic understanding. But I'm going to show you a way to be able to calculate it out to help you. So this is really just to give you some background information that there are really a lot of different things that are going to affect it. Another thing that can affect your kerf is your laser beam. Like if my laser beam is straight, then, see if you can see this, then we're going to have a nice little circle there. If my beam is a little bit angled, then I've got some scatter and it makes a wider area. The same thing is if your lens is dirty or damaged, that can also lead to laser scattering, and that's going to thicken the laser beam. So you want to make sure that your lenses are good and that they're clean as well. Okay, so those are just a few of the things that can affect kerf, although there are other things that can affect it as well. This just gives you kind of a basic understanding of it. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to figure out the kerf for your laser with your material and to adjust for that. So what I like to do is I will take a material and I will cut a 1-inch square. So in my software, it says that it is 1 by 1. Now, based off of everything that I just said, as my laser is cutting this square, it's actually burning away some of that material. So it's not going to end up being a 1 by 1 because we're creating that kerf as we cut. Now, if this is my, let's see, if this is my line that I'm cutting within my software and my beam is going across that line, it's actually going to be cutting a little bit on both sides, right? Because it's going straight down the line, but it's hitting a little bit of both sides. So kind of like if you're doing woodworking and you're trying to cut off the material, and let's say I want this right here to be 1 inch in length. So if I want this to be 1, and this is exactly measured at 1, when I set up my saw, I'm actually setting it up so that my saw blade, the edge of it is on that line so that it cuts the excess away over on the side that I'm going to throw away, so that this can stay 1 inch, because my saw blade is really cutting over here, which if I was going to line it up, my saw blade would actually, the center of it would be right here and not necessarily on the line. But when we're doing it with the laser beam was going to cut right on top of that line that you have from your software. So it's going to end up burning a little bit away from both sides, the inside of your shape and then the outside of the material that you're not keeping, or your scrap portion. So just keep that in mind, that it is burning away on both sides of the actual laser beam. And what I did is after I cut it my 1 inch, and I did it with just 2 different materials, but of course you can use whatever materials you use most. Then what I do is I'm gonna measure it. Now, it's supposed to be 1 inch, but like I said, we cut it away, and due to kerf, we know we're gonna lose some of that. So I'm gonna use my calipers. If you don't have a set of calipers, this is probably one of the most important tools that you can get as a laser owner. And I'm gonna turn it on. Now notice right now, it's in the closed position, but it says 0.0005. What I wanna do is you have a clear or a 0 button on your calipers. I'm gonna click on that and I wanna 0 it out. So I am telling my calipers at this closed position, I am at 0. And right now I'm using inches. Of course, you can change it to millimeters if you are more familiar with that. But I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna open these up by sliding my thumb on the circle, and I'm going to measure my 1 inch square. So this is Home Depot's Spartan Oak. It's an MDF, and it's coming out as 0.992. I'm gonna go ahead and write that on here, 0.992. I might actually do that in Sharpie so it's a little bit easier to see. Okay, now I'm gonna do that for my acrylic. This is just 1/8 inch acrylic. I think this was proof grade from my old Glowforge stuff. And I am going to, again, measure my 1 inch square that I cut out. And you'll see this one is 0.988. Okay, so notice these are different measurements, and yeah, it's off by only a slight amount, and that's okay. For a lot of things, you don't need to have like that perfect fit, but for some things where you're doing an inlay and you want it to fit nice and tight and you don't want to have to use any adhesives and you don't want to worry about it ever falling out, then it is nice to have a more accurate measurement. So these 2 materials are both 1/8 of an inch, but they both have a different kerf. And part of that is due to the fact that I do have to use different settings. Even though the focal height is the same for my laser for both of these materials, I do use different settings to cut through them. And again, we learned before that speed can actually affect the kerf. So that could be part of the reasoning here. But if I have 0.988 and 0.992, well, when I cut this out, I cut away this side part and this side part, right? So I got 2 parts of the kerf to make that difference from 1. But also, as I mentioned before, because the laser cuts right on the middle of the line, only half of that amount of kerf was actually on this side on my finished piece. The other part that was burned away is on my waste side. It's on my scraps. So really, if this was half and this was half of the kerf, then together that's gonna give me the whole amount of kerf. And so to figure out what my kerf is, I'm just gonna subtract that number by 1. So 0.988 out of 1. And that's gonna give me, let's check my math skills here. Let me get a piece of paper, write this down. .012. Now, remember at the beginning that I said a lot of people will say, just do 0.01 as your kerf. Well, you can see that that's actually pretty close to what we were looking for. Now, this one's a little bit different, so that would change for this one. But if you are just starting off and you really don't want to have to do any measuring, you don't have to worry about it, but you want to be able to design some things and try it out, you can just use that rule of thumb of 0.01 and then adjust from there if needed. A lot of times when I'm doing a file and it's gonna have pieces that clip together, or it's gonna have like inlay pieces, like for example, for this little movable girl here that I have magnets that are inside these holes, and I wanted to make sure that these magnets fit in really well, then I'll just do a test cut first. So instead of cutting out my whole design and then possibly all of my holes being the wrong size, I'll take just a little tiny square. I don't even use an inch. It's probably about 1/2 inch. And I put the little circle that I'm going to cut out in that square, and then I test my magnet to fit into that circle. And if that fits, then I know that all of these are going to work. So it's the same thing for any of your files. If you're using tabs and you're making a box, just cut off one of the tabs and cut out one tab and one of the little openings for the tab to fit in and test it out. And if that fits, then go ahead and run your file. And then you should have less waste, because if it doesn't fit, then you've only wasted a tiny amount of material instead of all of the material for your entire project. But just rule of thumb, like we said at the very beginning, you could use 0.01, but it's nice to actually check out your different material. It'll vary also by thickness. I only used 1/8 inch material for this example, but if I cut a 1/4 inch material, I might see a difference in my kerf number. Obviously, my settings are going to be a little bit different for cutting that thicker wood or thicker acrylic, whichever one I'm using. So that's going to affect it as well. But if you just figure out what your kerf is, then this is what you can use to adjust. So if I had cut this square out and I want something to fit inside that hole that I had left, let me actually pull up an example here. So here is the actual material that I cut my acrylic out of, right? So, and that's where our 0.012 is. If I want to inlay something in here, let's say it's one of my earrings and I want to fit a 1 inch square right into this piece that I cut out. Because remember, this was 1 inch when I cut it out, which we know after the fact that it was 0.988. I can't just use that same size to fit in there. So if I went and I cut, let's say this same 1 inch square from another 1/8 inch acrylic that's maybe pink, and I want to just fit it in, it may not fit well, because look, when I put this same material in, it doesn't stay. Because remember, I lost all of that material that got burned away. That 0.012 got burned away, and so now this no longer fits really well. So what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to look at the size of my item, and instead of cutting out a 1 inch square to fit in here, I'm going to cut out a square that's 1.012 and see if that can fit within my square. Let me go grab it. Don't you love the marvels of technology? What seemed like a millisecond for you was me actually realizing that I was unprepared and hadn't cut out my little extra square here. And so I turned it off and I went really quickly and I cut out my square at 1.012 because that's the size with the kerf added in so that that will fit better. So this is what it was as a 1. If I try to fit it in, it just falls out, right? Because that extra material is cut away, just like we showed before. Now, if I do 1.012 and I added in that kerf distance that we figured out from measuring it out, it fits in perfectly. No falling out. Nice and perfect. Now, I could push and pop that out. And depending on the fit that you want, if you want it to be a little more tighter where you have to maybe hammer it in a little bit with a mallet so that it's for sure is staying, then of course you can make this a little bit larger. So you can kind of adjust based on what you're looking for. But just to give you an idea, that is how I accommodate for kerf. I cut it out a 1 inch square. I measure it with my calipers and subtract that by 1, which is going to tell me what my kerf is. And then I add that to the piece that I then want to add in. And that's, oh, my lights are doing something funky. Sorry about that. And that's going to give me that perfect fit. So we learned a lot today about some different reasons that kerf can change. We talked about our focus height, and I used our nice little red light flashlight and showed you how the spot where your laser beam is hitting, that focus height is going to affect the width of your kerf. We talked about speed, and I used my wood burning tool, and I showed you slow versus fast and show how your settings can actually change your kerf as well. We also talked about how, depending on the head of your laser being square, so your laser beam is going straight down. Also, if you have any cracks, or if your laser's dirty and it creates some of that laser splattering, that's going to make your laser beam wider on your material, so that could affect it. But then after all of that, we calculated it out and we were able to figure out how to get that nice perfect fit. But I want to share with you one last thing. When you are using a laser beam, your laser beam is coming in at an angle. Look at my beautiful laser beam that I made out of MDF. Isn't having a laser fun? Anyways, my laser beam is coming in and it's cutting through. And because it comes at an angle, obviously this is exaggerated, but because it's coming in at an angle, my cutouts are tapered slightly. And so if I'm trying to fit something in one way, and let's say I don't love the fit, you could always flip it over and see how the fit is the other way. See, now this one's a little tighter, and I might actually need to use a mallet to knock that one in. I'm not going to because I don't have one on hand, but notice how it's, oh, there we go. It's a little bit more difficult to get it in this way. So depending on what side your material is on, because that laser beam comes in kind of at an angle, it's got that taper to it, your cuts are gonna have a taper to it. And it's not noticeable. It's not like you could look at it and be like, oh, that's tapered. You're not gonna notice. But some of those small little tiny imperfections or those small little tiny adjustments matter when you're trying to fit things together. And so it's just good to know, hey, this doesn't fit in really well. Before I cut another test piece out and try a different size, let me just flip this over and see if it fits in better this way. So just another helpful tip. Anyways, I hope some of this helped you and you were able to get just a basic understanding of what kerf is and how to measure for it with your materials, with your settings on your laser, and adjust to be able to get that perfect fit. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll be adding a lot more tutorials to our YouTube channel. We're just starting off, and so I hope to share a lot more content with you guys. Thanks so much.